How My Camera Caught a Bank Robber by Elton J. Buckley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lester Drake's detective camera first created the idea of photography in my mind. Before that, I hadn't the slightest inclination toward the art whatever, but when Lester purchased his neat little leather-covered box, and went around merely pressing a button and getting dozens of pictures by no other means, I immediately decided that I, too, must have a camera. Lester's was not an expensive one. His father had found it in one of the photographic establishments in Philadelphia, and being of a slightly scientific turn of mind himself, had purchased it and brought it home to Lester. The latter fitted up a corner of the cellar as a dark room, and straightway launched himself as an amateur photographer. Lester's first attempts, revealed by the chemical development, were surprisingly good, and inspired a strong feeling of envy in the breasts of those of his comrades whose fathers were blind to the oft-repeated advantages and delights of amateur picture-taking. Even more exasperating, he straightway became the idol of all the girls at school, whose zeal in posing for him was only equalled by the grotesqueness of some of their postures. I brooded long and deep over this unpleasant condition of affairs, and finally arrived at the conclusion that I would have a camera like Lester at any cost. Lester was kind enough to initiate me into the mysteries of his dark room, and to allow me to examine the interior of his camera by ruby light. With the knowledge thus gained, I resolved to manufacture one myself. It wouldn't be as handsome as Lester's, perhaps, I thought, but it might do just as good work. So I made the attempt using the lenses from an old microscope which I owned, but in vain. The instrument never reached the second stage of its construction. The contrast between Lester's clean, smoothly covered box and what I knew mine would appear, even if I could finally complete it, was too great, and I abandoned it in despair. Then I tried another tack. My father was exceedingly sceptical concerning the desirability of amateur photography, and flatly refused to furnish the necessary funds. It was October then, so I conceived a plan by which I would earn money during the fall by corn husking among the nearby farmers, so that when spring opened I would have the price of the coveted camera. No one could have worked harder during the weeks through which the season lasted than did I. Huskers were in demand that fall, and I secured work wherever I applied. It is just possible that if Lester had grown tired of his camera in the meanwhile, and had ceased to use it, my desire for one might likewise have gone by the board, but the snap of his shutter was heard everywhere and at all times, and even at night, by flashlight, in the barns, where the frequent huskings were progressing. When, after a few weeks, the farmers ceased to require huskers, I struck up a bargain with our grocer whereby I was to spend Saturdays running errands for him. The money from this helped out wonderfully, and, according to my expectations, when April opened a snug little sum reposed as the fruit of my labours in one corner of my top bureau drawer. As soon as the weather moderated slightly, Lester, who now posed as a photographic oracle, and myself, went to the city one fine morning to buy the camera. The neat little leather-covered box was duly inspected and purchased, together with the pamphlet of instructions that seemed so enticingly mysterious to my uninformed mind. The camera was just like Lester's, with the exception of some minor improvements which had been effected since the time when he had purchased his. On the way home, Lester and I drew up a compact whereby I was to have the use of his darkroom and chemicals until I felt that I was fairly on my photographic legs. Then I was to fix up one of my own. The camera had been sold loaded with plates, ready for use, and I lost no time in snapping several views here and there as the fancy seized me. Lester taught me to develop them, and when the most of them came up under the chemicals clear and sharp, my delight was great. And when I made prints from them, and the familiar home scenes and my playmates' faces were there plainly before me, it seemed to me that the universe could hold nothing more entrancing than amateur photography. Of course I had failures, but they were few compared with the successes. One morning in May, after I had become thoroughly versed in the art of using the camera and had fitted up a darkroom of my own in the attic, Lester and I sallied out with our cameras, for no other purpose than to secure a half dozen snapshots whenever desirable ones might present themselves. It was an ideal day for picture taking. Rain had fallen the night before and had left the atmosphere clear and brilliant, with none of that dim haze which is the cameraist's nemesis so often. We had strolled along the road, perhaps 2 miles out of the village, and had caught 3 or 4 very pretty views. None had presented themselves, however, for some time, when, by a turn of the road, we came upon a man drinking from a spring at the side of the road. He was but a few feet away, and was stooping down with his back toward us. "Let's get him," said I, in a low tone. "All right," replied Lester. "You do it, though. I've only got 1 plate left." I had several unexposed plates remaining in my camera, so I pointed the box toward the man and pressed the button. Just at the instant when the shutter must have operated, the man heard us and turned his head, facing us squarely. He evidently understood what we were about, for he scowled deeply and walked rapidly away through the woods, without, however, offering to molest us. He carried a small black grip with him. As the man's retreating figure disappeared through the trees, Lester and I drew a long breath of relief, for we felt like criminals detected in a crime, and we were a trifle afraid of the fellow beside. We wandered on a little further, snapping a few more wayside pictures, and then turned toward home and retraced our steps. That afternoon Lester came over to my father's house to witness the development of the morning's pictures. As, one by one, we put the plates through the developer, a majority came out well. 1 or 2 were a trifle underexposed, and there were minor defects in others, but, on the whole, they were very good. The star negative of the lot, however, was that of the stranger whom I had photographed drinking, and who had turned his head and caught me in the act. That was perfect. Everything was brilliantly sharp, and the shutter had caught the man's full face. In the negative even so small an object as his eyes stood out beautifully. We made a blueprint of this negative, and both Lester and myself recognized the faithfulness of the likeness, notwithstanding the fact that we had seen the man but a moment. About the middle of the afternoon my father returned from the neighbouring town, 10 miles away, in one of the banks of which he was clerk. He seemed to be much excited and perturbed about something. My mother noticed it also, and immediately inquired as to the cause of his uneasiness. "The bank was robbed last night," he answered, "and over $50,000 stolen. Every cent I had in the world is gone with the rest." My mother made an exclamation of dismay. "And the worst of it is," went on my father, "that we are almost certain who the thief is, but we haven't a thing in the world to trace him by, not a vestige of a photograph or anything like it, which we could give to detectives to guide them in the hunt. The man's gone, and the money with him." And my father sank despondently into a chair. Meanwhile Lester and I stood by, listening silently, the still wet blueprint in my hand. After a minute I went and pressed the print out flat upon the table, on which my father's arm was leaning. At any other time I would have proudly exhibited it to him, and would have been sure of his interest and appreciation, but I did not feel like intruding upon his present worriment. As I laid the picture face upward upon the table, my father turned his head and looked at it indifferently. Suddenly he pushed me aside and bent over the print so closely that his face almost touched it. I recovered my balance with difficulty and stared at him in frightened bewilderment. My father had never acted in this manner before, and I was almost afraid he had gone mad. "Great Scott!" he exclaimed. "The very thing!" Then, wheeling around, he grasped me by the shoulders and wanted to know where I got that picture. I was far too dazed by his strange actions to answer a word, so Lester interposed and told my father, in as few words as possible, of our morning expedition, and of the man whom we had photographed in the act of drinking. "Bless the camera!" ejaculated my father excitedly. "That's Eli Parker, the thief, and the best likeness of him I ever saw, too." Then he questioned us closely as to the direction the man had taken when discovered, and ended by confiscating the print and the negative, and rushing out of the house to take the next train back to town. Lester and I talked about it all the afternoon, and felt ourselves quite heroes for having the temerity to stand before a real bank robber. 50 prints were immediately struck off from the negative, and these were given to detectives, who scoured the country in every direction. After a 2 days' search, those nearest home were successful, and found Parker in the same woods where Lester and I had first surprised him. He had sought to evade capture by avoiding railroads, and hiding himself until the first excitement of the robbery had passed. As the whole amount of stolen funds was discovered in the little black grip which he carried, he was convicted of the crime without difficulty, and sentenced for a term of 15 years in state prison. The sequel of the incident was the most agreeable and the most astonishing of all. One day, a month subsequent, when Parker had been safely housed in the penitentiary, my father came home, and, with a mysterious smile upon his face, handed me an envelope. Upon being opened, the discovery was made that Howard Benton and Lester Drake were authorized to draw upon the First National Bank of C for $100 apiece, in slight recognition of their part in apprehending Eli Parker, the perpetrator of the recent robbery upon that institution. I am still an ardent disciple of amateur photography. Who wouldn't be under such circumstances? End of How My Camera Caught a Bank Robber, by Elton J. Buckley.